I'm Eleanor Vance, and at 38, I had led soldiers across war zones, earned medals no one ever pinned, and survived missions most commanders wouldn't take. But none of that prepared me for what my own family did. When I showed up to my brother's military ceremony, one he claimed to have led, they told me I wasn't on the list. I stood there, medals on my chest, and watched him take credit for my war. That night, I didn't raise my voice. I raised the truth. And when the cameras went live, I made sure the world saw what they tried to erase. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever been pushed into the shadows so someone else could shine, hit like and subscribe. Because this story is for you. This wasn't the first time I'd been erased. Years ago, when I graduated from West Point with honors, my father was too tied up with court cases to attend. My mother, Patricia, sent flowers and a voicemail. William texted one word, "Congrats." This time, things were supposed to be different, or so they claimed. The thick envelope had arrived just 3 days earlier, with no return address, only the Vance family crest embossed on the back. Inside, there was a heavy silk invitation and a short handwritten note from Patricia. "We hope you'll join us, Eleanor. This is a significant family milestone." Not a single word about what I'd accomplished. Not even a whisper of apology for years of silence. I drove from Nevada to Maryland in 2 days, barely stopping along the way. The road was cold and endless, yet with every mile, it felt like I was burning away a layer of doubt. I didn't tell anyone I was coming, not Dorothy, not General Sterling, not even my unit. I didn't want comfort or warnings. I just wanted to see it all with my own eyes. No interference, no shielding, just the raw truth. And now I stood inside the house I once called home, wearing full military dress. The medals on my chest felt heavier than usual, not from their weight, but from the silence they stirred. Patricia floated through the room like a perfectly trained hostess, her pearls gleaming and her smile polished to perfection. Richard leaned against the fireplace with a glass of whiskey, chatting with 2 of William's old ROTC friends. William himself stood at the center, tall, tan, effortlessly charismatic, telling some well-rehearsed story about navigating hostile terrain with nothing but grit and a compass. He pointed to a framed photo on the mantel, both of us in desert uniform. It had been cropped. Only his name appeared in the caption. I lingered near the bookshelf, half shadow, half spectator. Now and then someone would glance in my direction, then quickly look away, as if unsure whether I was real or just a ghost in crisply pressed blue. "You didn't RSVP," Patricia said behind me, her voice sugar-smooth but unyielding. "I didn't know I was invited," I replied, without turning around. Her laugh was brittle. "Oh, of course you were. This is a family event," William chimed in, as if reading from cue cards. I turned to face her. Her eyes flicked briefly across my ribbons, then up to my face, careful not to linger. "You look so formal," she said. "It's a military ceremony," I answered. "Yes, well, most of the guests are in suits." Before I could respond, she snatched the program from my hand. "Isn't it lovely? We hired a local designer, very tasteful." "My name's not in it," I noted. A pause, short but sharp enough to slice through pretense. Her lips tightened in feigned concern. "I'm sure it's just a formatting error. The spotlight, of course, is on William. He's the one still on active duty." I didn't blink. "We served in the same campaign." "Yes," she said slowly, "but he's still on active duty. You've moved into more of an administrative role, haven't you?" I stayed silent. She reached up to adjust the gold chain at her neck. "Honestly, Eleanor, please, don't make tonight difficult. This is a celebration. Let's not drag old wounds into the light again." It was laughable, really. She always mistook my silence for drama, my restraint for danger. The room erupted in applause as William wrapped up yet another story. I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. Dozens of people clapped and laughed like nothing was missing. Like my name had never been printed, never been spoken, never even mattered. I wore my uniform, as I always had. I'd led missions across continents, through terrain and fire. But here, in the house I grew up in, I was little more than a shadow, a ghost in pressed blues. The silence in my Nevada apartment was a different kind of quiet than in Annapolis. In Nevada, it was chosen, thick with dust and distance, not rejection. Desert light filtered through the curtains, sharp and indifferent. My bag still sat half unpacked after the drive, and my uniform jacket hung over the back of a chair, creased from the long trip. The program from William's ceremony rested untouched on the table, right beside the envelope Patricia had sent. I hadn't decided whether to throw it away or frame it as evidence. I opened my laptop and logged into the secure archive. The declassification notice had come that morning. Operation Desert Serpent was now officially declassified after 4 years of strategic silence. That mission had taken weeks of planning, cost us 3 drones, and claimed dozens of lives. It was my mission. My hand gripped the trackpad as I scrolled through the summary report. Under Commanding Officer, one name stood out. Captain William Vance, not Lieutenant Colonel Eleanor Vance, not even a footnote. My breath caught in my throat, and that bitter, familiar taste rose up like acid. I dug deeper, comms logs, GPS paths, internal assessments. I recognized my own phrasing in the daily sit-reps, the escalation protocols I had written from scratch. The after-action report bore my signature, at least it used to. Now the metadata listed someone else. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. They hadn't just erased me. They'd rewritten the past. The phone rang, a soft and steady chime from the corner of the room. I didn't need to check the screen. Only one person still called me from a landline. I picked it up. "Hello, Mrs. Dorothy?" Dorothy Vance didn't bother with pleasantries. "They think they can wipe you out with paperwork and pretty speeches," she said, voice as dry as Nevada air. "They're doing a decent job," I muttered. "You don't need their invitation to exist, Eleanor. You never did." There was a pause. "But you showed up anyway." "I needed to see it for myself." "Good, now make sure they see you." After we hung up, I turned back to the laptop. A new email had landed in my inbox, marked priority, from Lieutenant Consul Ben Carter. Saw Desert Serpent just got declassified. I tried flagging the reports. What they released is incomplete. No mention of the southern flank maneuver. I remember you coordinated it from the drone's blind zone. You saved us from losing a whole battalion. I'd testify under oath. You were in command. My pulse quickened. I opened the archived unredacted version, the one only a few of us had access to back then. There it was, my tactical maps, my coded call signs, the full command structure I'd outlined. Everything lined up except one thing, the signature block. It now bore a clean, unmistakable name, William Vance. The font was too perfect, too recent. I checked the metadata, edited 5 months after final submission. 5 months after I'd been promoted to lieutenant colonel, and had quietly requested that the department keep it confidential. I didn't want to outshine William. He was still junior, still struggling to find his place. I thought I was being kind. I opened the scan of the final updated report. Embedded deep in the admin log was a small note. Amended for internal consistency per request of R. Vance 3421D. R. Vance, my father. I stared at the screen. My mouth suddenly dry. This wasn't some clerical mishap. This wasn't a departmental oversight. It was him. All the legal acumen he'd once boasted about. All the favors he'd banked within the military policy circles. His pristine reputation as a guardian of protocol. He had weaponized it. Not to protect, but to erase. To erase me. He didn't just show bias. He executed a cold, calculated rewrite of the truth, replacing his daughter with his son in the record of service. This wasn't personal preference. It was deliberate revisionism. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, then moved with resolve. I downloaded the unedited original and saved it to a secure drive. I archived every log, every editorial note. I wanted the timestamps, the IP addresses, the version history, everything. They had rewritten the record once. They wouldn't get the chance to do it again. It was time they remembered who had truly commanded that battlefield. Even with my ID, they still asked me to wait outside. The Arlington sun was blinding, reflecting sharply off pale marble and ceremonial brass. Flags lined the walkway like rows of teeth. Tight, silent, unmoving. I adjusted the charcoal lapel of my blazer and stepped toward the entrance, swallowing the rise of tension in my chest. This wasn't the first time I'd been stopped at a door. Years ago, I was denied access to the Defense Policy Summit in D.C., despite being a seated board member. I'd made the mistake of entering without my rank insignia. They assumed I was someone's assistant, maybe an intern. It took an hour of arguing and a call to General Sterling just to get through the door. No apology ever followed. But this wasn't Washington. This was family, or so I'd told myself. Foolishly, as it turns out. The young guard at the gate looked no older than 25, Tight haircut, clean lines, eyes trained. He glanced at my military ID, then down at his tablet. His brow furrowed. "Eleanor Vance?" he asked, angling the screen toward me. "Yes," I replied. He tapped a few keys. "I'm sorry, ma'am, your name isn't on the list." I didn't flinch. "I received an official invitation. This event is for Operation Iron Eagle, correct?" "Yes, ma'am, for active officers and those being honored." He hesitated. "Do you have a printed copy of the invitation?" "No," I said flatly. "It was hand-delivered by Mrs. Patricia Vance." That caught his posture. "Please wait here," he said, disappearing into the shaded interior beyond the arch. I stood in the shadow of the gate as cars pulled up behind me, well-dressed guests in tailored suits and long gowns stepping out. A woman adjusted her son's tie while the father shook hands with an officer. Inside, soft music drifted from the stage, brass instruments tuning, polite conversation buzzing beneath it. Then I saw her, Patricia, gliding past the gate in a deep navy gown, heels clicking on the stone. She glanced in my direction and didn't break stride. No smile, no acknowledgement, just a blink, as if brushing lint off her sleeve. I could have called out. I didn't. Instead, I adjusted my cuff and waited. The guard returned. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said again. "Your name is not authorized. I can't let you in without clearance." "You saw my ID." "Yes, ma'am, but—" A voice rang out from beyond the gate. "She's with me." Dorothy Vance stood just inside the courtyard, one hand resting on a cane, her back straight and unyielding despite her age. She didn't shout. She didn't have to. Her presence filled the space like a drumbeat. "She's a Vance. She belongs here." The guard turned to me, caught between protocol and instinct. I held his gaze. "All right," he said, stepping aside. I crossed the threshold. Heads turned as I passed. Conversations paused, then resumed with awkward softness. My name traveled in hushed tones, floating like smoke through boxwoods, and rows of white chairs. I recognized some faces from Williams' reserve unit, others from Annapolis committees. No one approached. One woman frowned at my simple suit. Another leaned into her husband, whispering something behind her hand, stealing a glance in my direction. My heels struck the cobbled path, deliberate, steady, and sharp. Every step echoed louder than any outcry I could have made. I entered the main courtyard. On either side of the walkway, cadets in full honor guard stood at attention, swords raised in a silent salute for those being honored. And I walked straight through them. I wasn't in uniform. I wasn't in the program. But I moved through that corridor of steel like I had been summoned, because I had led soldiers through far worse than this. As I approached the main reception area, I saw my mother, Patricia, standing beside the podium, deep in conversation with an event coordinator. Her face shifted the moment she spotted me, lips pressed tight, eyes narrowing in disbelief. She moved quickly toward me, her voice low and urgent. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. I smiled. "And yet here I am," I replied, nodding toward the large screen glowing above the stage. William's name stood bold, Commander, with no mention of the strategist who made it possible. The projector whirred softly as it warmed up, casting a pale blue hue across the polished oak platform. The seal of the United States Army faded into bold white text against black. Operation Iron Eagle, a commander's story. I took my seat near the back, beside Dorothy, in the row marked family. Half the seats were still empty. Most of the guests had gathered near the front, senators, generals, Gold Star families. The room hummed with a rehearsed solemnity. We were an hour away from the official event, a live national broadcast where my brother would be celebrated before the country. But for now, it was just rehearsal. William stood center stage, dressed in a tailored uniform, flanked by 2 aides and a media tech. He cleared his throat. "Good afternoon. 4 years ago, in the rising heat of the northern front of Desert Serpent, I stood on a ridge overlooking the valley. Enemy drones circled overhead, friendly comms were down, and every path forward led into chaos." His voice was steady, polished, just humble enough. I'd heard this performance before, back when we were teenagers, and he practiced speeches in the bathroom mirror, back when he still called me sis instead of that lieutenant colonel who never smiles. I opened my notebook. "With limited personnel and no drone support," William continued, pointing to a map on the screen behind him. "I coordinated my units into a pincer attack. Risky, but it allowed us to reclaim Zone 3 and stabilize the evacuation corridor." I gripped my pen tightly but kept writing. Each phrase was lifted straight from my own reports. I had said those exact words to Ben, to General Sterling, to the War College panel after we returned. I remembered the sweat of that hearing, my trembling hands, knowing I wouldn't be quoted, only recorded. Beside me, Dorothy leaned in and gently touched my wrist. Her hand was cool but firm, her thumb brushing my pulse. She didn't speak, but I heard her loud and clear. "It's time," William went on, recounting my work as if he had invented it. He didn't ad-lib, he had rehearsed this down to the syllables, polished it until it sounded natural, as though it were his own memory. The screen changed again. Now came the tactical overlays, the visual spine of the operation. Color-coded roads, terrain shifts, infrared sweeps. I knew them like the back of my hand. I'd spent nights curled over those graphics, aligning units with air support, identifying blind spots no algorithm could solve. Except now, stamped boldly across the top slide, Mission Design, Captain William Vance. My lips parted slightly. I barely registered the rest. The audience murmured with admiration, a few officers nodding at the brilliance of the maneuvers. I sat motionless, each lie blooming like rot on every surface. He hadn't just stolen credit, he had altered memory. When the rehearsal ended and the lights rose, aides began clearing note cards and adjusting mic levels. William stepped down from the stage with effortless charm, shaking hands, accepting praise. He didn't look back at me, or maybe he did and chose not to see me. Dorothy remained still, her hands folded on her cane. "This is how dynasties work," she said softly. "One child becomes the statue, the other becomes the shadow." I exhaled slowly, wrestling the urge to stand and confront him right then. But this wasn't the moment, not yet. My phone buzzed in my lap. I glanced down, a message from Ben. "Stage fully set, cameras live, see you in 30. He didn't ask why I waited so long. He simply wrote, "I'm glad you didn't wait any longer." The shared office was still and thick with silence, the kind that comes just before a storm finally breaks. Sunlight filtered through half-closed blinds, striping the mahogany table in front of me. I hadn't sat across from a superior officer like this in over a year, certainly not without knowing exactly what agenda was on the table. But this time, the room felt different. It felt personal. General Sterling leaned back in his chair, the weathered lines of his face giving away nothing. Behind him, a framed photo of the 203rd Tactical Regiment hung next to his own medals, testament to the 3 major campaigns he'd led over 2 decades. And yet now, it was my name that made his brow furrow. He slid a thick dossier across the table, stamped in sharp red ink, declassified. "I reviewed the original Desert Serpent files this morning," he said. "The real ones, not the revised submission they pushed to the Central Archive." I didn't say a word. I saw the coordination maps, the tactical overlays, the comm logs. He flipped to a page, my signature, time-stamped weeks before any of the so-called edits. Then another, metadata tracing access to a private law firm's IP address, Richard Vance's office, my father. "I know who commanded that mission," General Sterling said flatly. "And it wasn't your brother." I met his eyes. "Then why am I still not in the program?" "That's what I wanted to ask you," he paused. "Do you want to be?" For a moment, the room fell into an eerie stillness. I thought about every time I'd chosen silence, when I declined a promotion photo, when I refused to let the Academy publish my case study, when Ben asked me why I always stood 2 steps back. I hadn't wanted the price, the questions, the spotlight. I didn't want to hurt William. I'd told myself survival was enough, not anymore. "I don't want a speech," I said. "I don't want applause. I want the truth, stated plainly, formally, recorded. I don't want to look like the victim who showed up late to claim credit." Sterling nodded slowly. "Good, because I just added a line to my speech." He slid over another sheet, just an addendum. Acknowledgement of command, Operation Desert Serpent. No flourish, no fanfare, just a correction, a name. "You don't have to go on stage," he added. "But it will be said, on the record, publicly. They will not erase you." I exhaled, slowly. For the first time in days, the weight on my shoulders eased. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't victory. But it was something. My phone buzzed again. A message from Ben. "Stage set, cameras live. See you in 30. I stood, smoothing my jacket. "Thank you, General." He smiled, extending his hand. "Give them the name they tried to erase. Brigadier General Eleanor Vance." William stood at the podium, surrounded by the blood and sweat that once belonged to me. Cameras panned across rows of polished metals and pristine uniforms, bathed in Arlington's soft ceremonial glow. The event unfolded like theater, rehearsed, dignified, broadcast to military networks nationwide. Heavy flags swayed behind the stage, each one bearing the name of an operation tied to Iron Eagle, each a silent witness. I sat along the center aisle, invisible in a sea of brass and white gloves. Dorothy sat beside me, spine straight, cane beside her knee. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. William adjusted the mic. Distinguished guests, officers, veterans, and families. His voice rang out clear, composed. I knew that tone. I'd trained it into him once, when he panicked after failing a tactical simulation in officer school. I coached him for 3 weeks, whispering strategic analysis into video calls at midnight while I was stationed in Kandahar. He never thanked me, not once. Now he stood there, glowing in borrowed glory, retelling my story. Operation Desert Serpent tested every principle of modern warfare, he said. With limited communication and compromised terrain, I had to make decisions that would determine the survival of over 200 soldiers. The audience murmured in agreement. I watched as his hand gestured toward the screen behind him. A tactical map appeared, familiar down to the brushstroke. I knew it instantly. My lines, my notations, the field markers I could recite in my sleep. But this time, something was different. In the corner of the slide, where metadata and footnotes typically lived, a new line appeared. Strategic Command Architect. Call E.G. Vance. The font was small, but unmistakable. For a moment, the room held its breath. Then, the air shifted. A ripple of murmurs stirred from the front rows. A general leaned toward his aide. 2 journalists typed furiously on their tablets, and a Navy admiral squinted at the screen, flipping back through her briefing folder. William hesitated, just for a second. He glanced at the screen, eyes narrowing, a tiny crack in his polished mask, but he pressed on. Through careful coordination and adaptive maneuvering, a second slide appeared, another overlay, another signature. Final field authorization, E. Vance. The murmuring grew louder, the polite confusion turning into curiosity. Someone behind me whispered, "Wasn't she an intelligence?" Then a voice cut through it all, clear and steady. "Ladies and gentlemen," General Sterling said, rising from his chair and walking to the microphone. "If I may, I'd like to correct the record." He paused, letting his words drop like a gavel onto marble. William froze mid-sentence. General Sterling nodded calmly toward the screen. The tactical brilliance of Operation Desert Serpent has long been attributed to the officers in the field. But the true architect of that mission is sitting among us today. I didn't need to say a word. The documentation spoke louder than anything William had ever said. The room behind the stage was no longer just a waiting area. It had become a battlefield. Officers in pressed dress uniforms clustered in quiet reactive groups, studying tablets, flipping through dossiers. Screens looped the final slides from the ceremony on repeat, and faint from a nearby playback came the echo of Sterling's words. The true architect is sitting among us today. I stood against the far wall, near a window, letting gravity do its work. William sat slumped in a leather chair, jaw clenched, eyes darting between the glowing screen and the polished floor beneath his shoes. Patricia lingered close by, fury simmering beneath the polished exterior. She had been whispering sharply at him for 10 minutes, but he hadn't spoken a word. Ben approached, handing me a fresh copy of the official operational file, declassified 5 hours earlier, uploaded to the internal command archive, metadata and all. I accepted it silently. He hesitated, then added, "They've already cited it in the boardroom. Joint Command is convening a council Monday. The room is shifting fast." From across the room, General Sterling approached, measured, composed, a file folder in one hand, a sealed envelope in the other. "You've got admirers," he said with a faint smile, "and quite a few nervous suits back in D.C. And then, as if on cue, the massive display screen behind the stage flickered back to life, this time broadcasting directly to the press room just outside the hall. A combat strategy scan of Desert Serpent lit up in cold blue on a stark white background. At the bottom, in clean, unmistakable type, Commanding Officer Brigadier General Eleanor Vance, approved by Pacific Joint Command. Silence fell over the entire room. Even the whispers died away. Patricia hissed through clenched teeth, That file was never meant to be public." William looked like he was about to speak, but his throat tightened visibly. For a man so at ease behind a podium, he suddenly seemed allergic to the air around him. Then General Sterling stepped forward again, his voice steady, deliberate. "For those questioning the document's validity, allow me to be clear," he said. "This record has been reviewed by the Office of the Inspector General and the Department of Strategic Ethics. It is authentic. It reflects not only battlefield decisions, but the true chain of command as it existed." He turned toward the reporters in the room, each of them now poised with still cameras and blinking red lights. "From this moment forward, the official record will recognize Brigadier General Eleanor Vance as the strategic commander of Operation Desert Serpent." There was no applause, no audible gasp, only silence. The kind of silence that doesn't simply fall, it fractures. At last, William stood. "Sir, I wasn't aware there had been a mistake. I thought—" He gestured vaguely, groping for something solid in a room that no longer held it. "It must have been a clerical error. I never asked to have my name listed as commander. Someone else must have." "Stop," General Sterling said softly. "Your name did not appear there by accident. And the revision logs, some routed through your father's private servers, tell a different story." William opened his mouth, closed it, tried again, failed again. From the back of the room, I could feel Dorothy's gaze settle on me, steady, unwavering, just as it had always been. I didn't move, I didn't speak, I didn't need to. I looked into the lenses of the cameras aimed at me. Full cruise, perfectly focused, each lens hungry for a soundbite that would never come. I met their gaze and held it, long enough for them to wonder what it felt like. Long enough for the silence to hang like a verdict. Then General Sterling unfolded one last sheet of paper. "Additionally," he said, "the following will now be entered into the public record. Service commendations for Unit Kilo 17, under the command of General Vance. Each of these soldiers has submitted sworn testimony attributing their survival to battlefield decisions made under her orders." He read off 10 names, 11, 12, each one a nail driven into the coffin of the William Vance legend. William stood rigid, his shoulders locked, fingertips fumbling at the edge of his jacket, where 2 rows of shining medals hung like hollow promises. Then a hand rested gently on his shoulder. A tall, clean-shaven naval officer leaned in and said, just loud enough to carry, "Your promotion is under review." They had erased my name from the guest list, so I let them announce it on national television. The stage lights bathed the room in a brilliant golden hue, so radiant it felt theatrical, as if we were witnessing a scene from a play rather than a military honor ceremony. Cameras locked in on the podium, microphones glittered along polished rows of chairs. Hundreds of officers, veterans, and family members turned toward the man standing confidently at center stage. General Sterling cleared his throat. The audience, still murmuring from the earlier revelations, fell completely silent. He adjusted his glasses, then looked squarely toward the front row. "Before we conclude tonight's ceremony," he began, "there is one more name we must acknowledge." I let out a quiet breath. Beside me, Dorothy gently placed her gloved hand over mine for a brief moment, then released it. General Sterling's voice rang out, sharp and unwavering. "For far too long, credit has been misplaced, honor redirected, and a soldier who displayed intelligence, courage, and commanding skill was deliberately written out of her own legacy. Tonight, we correct that." He turned to face the cameras directly. "Please rise with me," he said, "as we officially welcome back to her rightful place, Brigadier General Eleanor Vance." The sound that followed wasn't applause, at first. It was chairs shifting, dozens at once, then hundreds. The entire room stood, save for 2 people. William remained seated, eyes fixed forward, his expression unreadable. Beside him, Patricia sat with arms crossed tightly over her chest, lips drawn into a thin, bitter line. Neither moved. But I did. Slowly, I rose. My uniform caught the light, the ribbons and medals aligned in precise formation. It was the first time I had ever worn the full set in public. Until tonight, it had remained folded in a garment bag at the back of my closet. Less a uniform, more a relic of someone I used to be. But tonight, I wore every piece, every ounce of earned weight. The aisle opened before me as I stepped toward the stage. Phones lifted in reverent silence. Camera flashes pulsed like distant lightning. The broadcast was live, beaming my image into homes, offices, and outposts across the globe. This time, no one tried to stop me. General Sterling met me at the edge of the stage and extended his hand. I took it. Behind him, the screen now displayed my name, centered, bold, and without asterisk. Brigadier General Eleanor Vance, Strategic Commander, Operation Desert Serpent. For one breathless second, the room held still, then a single clap, then another, and suddenly the hall erupted. Not in performance, not out of politeness, but in recognition. A young woman in uniform, no older than 24, stood a few rows to the left. Tears streamed silently down her cheeks, her hands clasped tightly at her chest. When our eyes met, she whispered something I could still hear through the thunder of applause. "She's the reason I stayed." My throat tightened. I stepped toward the microphone but didn't speak. I let the moment rest in its own weight. I looked out over the stage, into the cameras, and beyond them, toward the faces I couldn't see. Young women in ROTC halls, women embedded with combat units, soldiers who had been sidelined, silenced, rewritten. This was for them. Then the question came. A reporter, emboldened by the drama, called out from the front row, "General Vance, do you have anything you'd like to say to your family?" I met his gaze, held it. "No," I said simply. "This isn't their moment." She sat across from me now, draped in pearls and shame. The hotel room carried a faint scent of old roses and something antiseptic, expensive but sterile, like a space curated for someone who would never unpack. Of course, my mother had chosen the hotel closest to the academy. She always liked to be near enough to watch, but just far enough to claim detachment. She sat stiffly in the velvet chair, hands folded in her lap, her nails perfectly manicured. The pearls around her neck, her favorites, worn to every major family event, seemed to shimmer with a kind of strained anxiety. Not once did she look me in the eyes. I gently placed the yellow dossier on the glass coffee table between us. I didn't open it. She already knew what was inside. Her eyes flicked toward the folder, then back to me. "Eleanor," she began, her voice soft but deliberate. "I thought perhaps we could talk. Just the two of us. No cameras, no generals, no declarations." I didn't answer. Silence did. She tried again. "We're still family, despite everything." "You said that once before," I replied at last. "The day you asked me to withdraw from the senior command program because William needed it more, because, as you put it, our family name couldn't bear the weight of both of us succeeding." "I didn't mean it that way," she whispered. I opened the dossier. Inside was the original letter nominating me for promotion, the letter she had intercepted. Her handwriting curled along the margin. "Delay until William has established himself." Next to it, an undated email draft from 2 years ago. "Eleanor, I know you're hurt. I tried to protect you. The spotlight can be cruel. I didn't want you caught in it, especially not in competition with your brother." I slid the pages across the table. She didn't touch them. She just stared. "I found this in the print queue on your desktop," I said quietly. "You never sent it, but you wrote it." Her chin quivered. "I was afraid," she said. "Afraid of what?" "Of what it would do to our family, of what your father would say." "You mean," I corrected gently, "of what he'd say about you. You were afraid of being the mother whose daughter outshined her son." She covered her face, the pearl necklace rising and falling with each breath. "I didn't know how to help you," she admitted. "You were always so capable, and William, he always needed more." "He always did," I said. "And you didn't help either of us. You let him believe he was more than he was, and you let me believe I had to earn even the most basic recognition." Her tears came freely now, the kind that once controlled entire rooms, the kind that used to blur my sense of right and wrong, but they didn't work anymore. "You wanted me silent," she said in Vietnamese, reverting to our old language, as if it could smooth the edges. "And you succeeded, until now." I looked at her calmly. At last she raised her face, carefully made up to project sympathy, honed over years of country club diplomacy, now cracked and trembling. "I lost both my children tonight," she whispered. I stood, took the dossier, and walked toward the door. "No," I said, my hand resting on the handle. "You lost the child who was never truly yours. Blood gave me a name, but choice gave me purpose." The hall smelled faintly of lemon oil and something older, dust, maybe history. The walls were lined with framed commendations and portraits of long-retired officers, their faces frozen mid-decade, mid-command, mid-pride. I stood behind the podium, not as a guest, not as a forgotten daughter, not even as a soldier fighting to reclaim her place, but as someone creating something that had never existed before. The reporters had arrived early. Word of my reinstatement, the televised ceremony, and the declassified commendations had spread like wildfire. Now, they wanted interviews, angles, statements, something quotable enough to justify a headline. But today wasn't about them. Today was about the dozens of cadets sitting in the front rows. 4 of them were women. 2 still had ribbons fresh from basic training. 1 wore a wrist brace from a field injury. They weren't looking at me like I was a public figure. They were looking at me like I could be proof. Dorothy sat near the stage in her favorite navy coat. Her fingers clenched around a gold-embossed folder. She didn't blink, she didn't fidget, but her grip said everything. I leaned into the microphone. Today we are announcing the launch of the Dorothy Vance Initiative for Women in Defense. The room shifted. Pens scraped across notepads, cameras clicked, heads lifted. This fund, I continued, will provide strategic training grants, mentorship access, and deployment stipends for women pursuing leadership roles in military intelligence and combat command. It is named for the woman who taught me that service doesn't begin on the battlefield. It begins in silence, when you first choose to speak on behalf of someone else. Dorothy's eyes shimmered with tears, but she didn't smile. She simply nodded, quietly, proudly. Then came the reporters, one after another. What made you launch this now? How do you respond to those still questioning the document's authenticity? Are you still active in the command force? And finally, the question I'd been expecting. Do you still consider yourself part of the Vance family? That one didn't catch me off guard. It always came back to blood. I paused, letting the silence settle. I don't need to give up the name, I said evenly. I just needed to define it for myself. The name Vance was once used to silence me. Now it introduces me. That line appeared in 6 national publications within hours. By the end of the day, video of the speech had garnered over 3 million views. Messages flooded in from former cadets, senior officers, even young civilians raised in military families. Most of them said the same thing. You said what I never could. That night, back in my office at the academy, I cracked open the window and let the evening air drift in. The soft echo of marching steps carried faintly from the quad below. Dorothy had left her gold-embossed folder on the edge of my desk, but I didn't move it. It had already become part of the room, like the photo of me shaking hands with General Sterling or the framed page from my first field journal. I switched on the desk lamp and reached for the manuscript beside my chair, my memoir, still unfinished, but no longer hidden. Across the cover was the title I had finally chosen, The Uncommissioned Commander. I was revising the final passage when I heard the door creak open behind me. Footsteps, hesitant. I turned. William stood in the doorway, hands buried in his pockets, his tie crooked. I read your book, he said quietly. He wrote the truth in ink, then buried it between pages he hoped I'd never find. Morning light filtered softly through the lace curtains of Dorothy's reading room, casting a golden warmth that felt more like memory than daylight. It was the kind of light that lived in old houses, where the floors creaked and the air held the weight of years. I'd woken early, restless, only to find Dorothy already seated in her favorite corner chair, flipping slowly through the thick Vance family genealogy book she had retrieved from the back storage room the night before. You may want to see this, she said without looking up. Her finger rested on a folded envelope, yellowing at the edges, tucked between the pages labeled Family Legacy. My name was handwritten on the front, nothing else. I picked it up slowly. The paper was delicate. The seal had never been closed. No stamp, no date. But the handwriting was unmistakably my mother's, precise, angular, leaning slightly to the right, as if always bracing to defend itself. I sat down by the window and began to read. Eleanor, if you're reading this, then either I finally become brave or someone else did it for me. I don't know what you think of me now, maybe nothing at all, and perhaps worse than that. But there are things I need to say, even if it's too late. I knew you were different from the beginning, not just intelligent, brilliant. You looked at the world like it was a puzzle, always halfway solved, and that terrified me. You see, I was raised to believe men lead and women preserve, that we follow, soften edges, fill in gaps. You never accepted that role. You wanted your own map, and I didn't know how to be a mother to that. So I tried to shape you, and when that didn't work, I tried to erase the parts I didn't understand. I told myself I was protecting you, from disappointment, from isolation, from what the world does to women who refuse to live small. But in truth, I was protecting myself, from your shadow, from the guilt of knowing I wasn't enough to raise you properly. I knew you would outgrow me, knew it early, and so I began to slow you down. Quietly, subtly. The letter of recommendation that never got mailed, the phone call to my friend at West Point that I forgot to make, the application packet that somehow missed the deadline. Each one a pebble in your path, each one wrapped in the word love. But it wasn't love, was it? Not really, it was fear. And fear disguised as motherhood wounds just the same. I paused. My hands had started to tremble. Dorothy remained quiet across the room, pretending not to watch. The space held its breath. William was easier. He needed me. He idolized me. You didn't. You challenged me, and I hated how much I admired you for that. If I could do it again, I might choose to love you instead of fear you. That was the final line. No signature, just white space. I sat for several long moments, letting the silence fill the hollowness the letter couldn't reach. There were no justifications, no apologies, only acknowledgement. And somehow, that hurt more. Dorothy moved gently, as if careful not to startle me. Your mother never sent it, she said softly. I found it years ago, tucked between the family genealogy files. I kept it. I wasn't sure I'd ever show it to you. I'm glad you did, I replied. What will you do with it? I looked down at the envelope, then rose and walked into the next room, where the fireplace still held warmth from the night before. I placed the letter inside, unfolded, and struck a match. The flame licked at the paper, curling the edges inward as the ink withered into ash. I didn't need it framed. I didn't need it published. I didn't need anyone else to read it. Only one sentence stayed with me, etched deeper than the rest. If I could do it again, I might choose to love you instead of fear you. That was all the closure I needed. He didn't come to apologize. He came to justify. I heard the knock before I saw his face. Hesitant, uneven. 3 quick taps, then a pause, then one more. As if halfway through he questioned his own decision. I opened the door slowly, uncertain which version of him I would find on the other side. William stood there in an old hoodie, his khaki pants wrinkled at the knees. He looked smaller somehow, not physically, but in presence. The effortless charm he once wore like a second skin had fallen away, like a jacket he no longer knew how to put on. Hi, he said. I stepped aside. Come in? The apartment smelled faintly of coffee and fresh paper. Dorothy had sent over another stack of archival letters for the memoir I was finishing. I gestured toward the couch. He sat stiffly, hands clasped, as if bracing for a verdict. I said nothing. I waited. I've been thinking, he began, eyes fixed on the floor. About what happened. About everything. Silence. I used to think it was harmless, he said. Just borrowing a little credit, letting people assume. Dad always said, it's all part of the machine, right? Optics. And what did you think when you signed your name to that final report? I asked. His face twisted. At first, I told myself it was temporary, that I'd fix it later, that someone else would fix it. But then, he exhaled. Then came the awards, the invitations, the articles, and it got harder and harder to imagine stepping aside. I looked at him. So you didn't? No. He finally looked up, eyes glazed. At some point, I convinced myself you didn't care. That if you wanted the credit, you would have taken it. I didn't respond. I let the silence stretch, filled with all the choices I had made to remain quiet. For the family, for the peace, for the fear. I saw your speech, he said. The one about the scholarship. The way you said you weren't giving up the name, that you were redefining it. I meant every word, I replied. He nodded slowly. I know. I came because I needed to say it, even if it doesn't matter now. I was scared, not of you, of what you would become if people truly saw you. Because I knew the moment they did, I would disappear. His voice broke on the last word. I let the silence settle between us once more. And did you disappear? I asked gently. He looked at me, really looked. Yes, and I deserve to. Eleanor, he whispered, can you ever forgive me? I leaned back slightly, my voice steady. That's not something I owe you, I said, but I hope one day you earn it for yourself. Some medals gleam under bright lights. This one gleamed in silence. Desert winds have a silence all their own, as if they carry the weight of secrets too heavy to speak aloud. The base lay tucked 2 hours past the last highway, hidden by heat and distance. No signs, no press, no flags flapping in ceremonial rhythm. Just concrete, steel, and discipline. I'd been here before, years ago, when I was just a name on a rotation list. Back then, I wasn't allowed to lead, only to observe, to remain unseen. Today was different. Lieutenant Colonel Ben Carter met me at the gate with a clipboard and a half-smile. "Still hate handshakes?" she asked. "Still allergic," I replied. She handed me a black lanyard, no insignia, no title, just permission. "They're ready for you." The ceremony room was smaller than most base storage units. 20 chairs in 2 tight rows. No banners, no brass band, no high-ranking generals offering scripted praise. Just the people who mattered, the ones who knew. I recognized a few faces. Those who had moved on my orders, who had followed maps I'd sketched on the backs of ration boxes, who had trusted my voice in their ears when the visibility dropped to nothing. Ben stepped up to the podium with the ease of someone who had long ago stopped trying to impress. "We don't record these commendations," she began, "but we remember them. This one's overdue." There was no scroll, no gold leaf certificate, just a small black velvet box. She opened it with reverence and turned toward me. "For exemplary leadership in classified operations under the authority of the Black File designation, with distinguished conduct in joint multinational environments, we present Brigadier General Eleanor Vance with the DLD distinction." The room rose, not in applause, but in silence, the kind that means we see you. I stepped forward. My hand didn't tremble as she pinned the medal to my chest. No ribbons, solid, undecorated. I didn't feel adrenaline, just alignment, as if something in the world had finally clicked into place. After a short nod, I crossed to the far side of the room. One of the junior officers, a woman no older than 22, leaned in slightly as I passed. "They say you once turned down a top-level appointment," she whispered, eyes wide, "just to stay on the ground with us." I didn't answer. I only smiled. It was true. Not because I feared rank, but because I never wanted to lead from the balcony. I wanted to be where things happened, where the weight was real. Later, in a converted dormitory room, now serving as temporary quarters, I unpacked slowly. A cream-colored envelope peeked from a side pocket of my travel bag, Dorothy's handwriting unmistakable. She must have slipped it in before I left. I sat by the window, base lights flickering faintly against the desert sand, and opened the letter. You don't need cameras to be remembered. They tried to erase the girl who never bowed, never broke, never asked permission. But the world remembers truth louder than any ceremony. The girl they tried to erase became the woman history won't forget. Ink lasts longer than legacy. The final sentence came easier than I expected. I hadn't even noticed my hand had stopped trembling until I set the pen down and looked back at the pages, 243 in all. The invisible general, written in the margins of war, between deployments, in briefing tents and nameless cafes that never asked why I sat alone. I wrote most of it by hand, a habit I never let go. Typing came later, but ink is personal. Ink carries weight. Dorothy was the first to read it. She finished it in 2 days. When she handed the pages back, her eyes were wet but steady. You didn't write it to hurt them, she said. You wrote it to free yourself. The publisher didn't ask for edits. They only asked when I'd be ready to speak about it. I said no at first. I wasn't interested in a book tour. I didn't want a stage. Then came the invitation from the academy, not the main hall, just a quiet seminar. 10 cadets, all women, all first generation in the military. The session was titled Leading Without Permission. I stood before them in a small classroom, its mismatched chairs and flickering fluorescent lights, giving no hint of the history being shaped. It wasn't quite a moment for the textbooks, but there was something in the quiet of that room that felt monumental. We didn't begin with rank or regulations. I started with a simple question. What was the first thing they told you couldn't do? Dozens of hands shot up. Speak up. Take command. Apply for special forces. Disagree. I nodded slowly. Well, the fact that you're here now means you didn't listen. Laughter rippled through the room, tentative but real. Halfway through, a young woman with tight black braids and steady eyes raised her hand. "What do you do when no one believes you?" she asked. And in that instant, I saw myself. Years younger, angrier, quieter, sitting alone after being overlooked again and again. "You don't wait to be believed," I said, my voice deliberate. "You act like you already are." Something shifted then. A current passed through the room, quiet but unmissable. We moved forward into tactics, ethics, how to give orders without imitating the men who barked theirs like commands from a mountaintop. They asked the questions I once feared to voice, questions about integrity, loneliness, legacy. By the end of the 2-hour session, the energy in the room had changed. It wasn't eagerness, it was solidity. They didn't need rescuing. They needed someone who had survived. As the room emptied, one cadet lingered behind. She was petite, cloaked in a polished poise that barely concealed her anxious energy. She handed me a piece of notebook paper, folded small, and walked away before I could thank her. Inside, written in a slanting scrawl, "You changed the way I see myself." This time, they called my name first. I stepped onto the stage, not as a guest, not as a reluctant footnote in someone else's speech, but as the one giving it. Spring sunlight poured through the glass dome of Arlington Hall, casting golden lines across the polished floor. Rows of cadets stood at attention, uniforms crisp, anticipation humming just beneath the weight of ceremony and pride. Their families filled the hall with reverent silence. I had once stood in that audience. Now I stood before it. "Today," I began, "you are told you've earned your rank, but the truth is many of you have already led, without insignia, without permission, without applause." I let the silence settle, a silence that gives weight to the words that follow. You don't need to be listed to belong. You don't need an introduction to become unforgettable. And you certainly don't need recognition to be right. My eyes swept the room, and for a moment they paused at the far back corner. There, standing in shadow near the last row, was William. No uniform, no ceremony, just him, standing, watching, clapping. Not for me, I suspected, but for what I'd chosen to represent. I didn't smile. I didn't wave. I simply continued. The first name on the graduation list was Second Lieutenant Evelyn Sharp, the cadet who had once asked me, "What do I do when they say I don't belong here?" Now she did. I called her name. She stepped forward. I pinned her insignia not where tradition dictated, but directly on her collarbone, where it would be seen, where it couldn't be ignored. The same spot I was once denied. Dorothy sat in the front row, a small folded American flag resting in her lap. Her face was radiant, calm. We didn't need words anymore. The work had spoken loud enough. More names followed, more squared shoulders, more voices rising in oath. After the final cadet returned to formation, I stepped back to the mic. "Let them say I broke tradition," I said. I was never raised to uphold traditions that erased me. She was once erased from a program. Now she rewrote the rules others would follow. What began in silence, born from fear, ended with a name spoken with reverence. Because when injustice is met with quiet defiance and relentless truth, no lie can survive the spotlight forever. Some legacies are inherited, but the ones forged in pain and principle, they endure. If this story touched you, please like, share, and subscribe. And comment below. When was the moment you stood up for yourself, when no one else did? Tell us your story.